A really common question that students have is, can I use abbreviations? And if so, which words can I abbreviate? So let's go and see if we can find some info from the study design and also previous assessors reports. Let's look at, first of all, using the correct terms. What do we mean there? Well, it's important to use the correct terms. So, for example, you want to say profit and loss summary. P&L summary is acceptable. We'll look at that in abbreviations in a second. Just make sure that you don't write P&L sum. That's too much abbreviating. P&L is okay, but P&L sum's no good. You're going to write bank or cash at bank. You're not going to write bank / cash at bank. Remember, I'm talking about if you list it as a current liability when it's an overdraft. If it's an overdraft, you have to list it as overdraft. You don't list it as bank or cash at bank. GST clearing, that's the correct term. It's not GST. If we're writing it under current assets, we don't write GST refund. If it's a current liability, we don't write GST liability. It's always in the balance sheet as GST clearing. We always write stock control and not stock. We always write debtors control and not debtors. We always write creditors control and not creditors. In the cash flow statement, we're going to write collections from debtors. We're not going to write debtors control or debtors. Payments to creditors in the cash flow statement will be the same. We don't want to write creditors control or creditors. We're writing the name or the description of the transaction. And in the cash flow statement, we'll also write purchases of stock instead of stock control or stock. Can I abbreviate? Well, let's have a look. In the assessors report for 2009, it says, do not abbreviate unless it is absolutely necessary. When there is adequate space provided, full title should be used. Now, that's some good advice. The problem is it's very subjective. It says don't abbreviate unless it's absolutely necessary. Well, what does that mean? It also says there's when there is adequate space provided. Well, what does adequate space mean to some person with big handwriting? That's going to mean something a lot different to someone who writes very small. So if abbreviations can't be used when there's adequate space provided, what represents adequate space? So going back a few years, probably the best tip I could find was in the 2009 assessors report. It says the income statement, balance sheet and cash flow statement have ample room for full names at all times. So using that, let's come up with a bit of a rule. Always use full titles when you're doing your reports. So if you're doing an income statement, a balance sheet and a cash flow statement, no abbreviations. If you do have to abbreviate in something else like a ledger or a paragraph, always ask yourself, apply the qualitative characteristic of understandability. Would someone with no accounting knowledge know what your abbreviation meant? So here's some examples. Term cash at bank. You can abbreviate that to bank or cash. We can't use cab as in cash at bank. And we don't want to use cash and the at symbol bank. That's not acceptable. Accumulated depreciation, you can abbreviate that to AC DEPN and then the name of the asset. So e.g. shop fittings, but the one over here is no good, and that's because it hasn't got the name of the asset. You need to have the name of the asset in here, but that's an acceptable abbreviation. AC DEPN is fine. Cost of sales must be cost of sales. We're not going to write COS. Cost of goods sold is the same. We don't abbreviate that to COGS. Office expenses and office equipment. Remember, these are probably going to be in reports like an income statement, so we aren't going to abbreviate those. Interest expense and revenue will be the same. In particular, if it's an interest expense, we don't just write interest. If it's an interest revenue, we don't just write revenue, and that's because it could be either. To assume that someone understands just breaches the understandability characteristic, so make sure we write that in full. Prepaid rent expense, we want to write prepaid rent, prepaid rent expense, not prepaid rent or PP rent. Revenue accounts, so when we are doing the profit and loss summary ledger and we're closing all our revenues, we want to write revenue accounts. We don't want to just write revenue or revenue and abbreviate accounts to this sort of thing here. Same with expenses as well. Using specific words. So sometimes the question might ask you to use specific words. Now this is getting less common than it used to be in the exam. It used to have a lot of these tables. So you can see here you have to fill in the blanks. This still could happen and appear on the exam. And what you need to do is use the words you're given. So there it says you need to write increase, decrease, or no effect. So when if you think the answer is increase, that is what you're going to write. You're going to make sure that you write increase. You're not going to write anything like up, overstated, higher, or an arrow. None of those are the word increase. You wouldn't get the mark. Likewise with decrease, that's what we want to write. We're not going to write down, understated, lower, or an arrow. And no effect, you've got to write no effect. You can't write none, you can't write nil, you can't do a dash. And most importantly, you can't leave it blank and expect to get the mark. Because that way everybody in the state will get the mark who didn't even attempt the question. Terms in the cash flow statement. This is an important one. Remember, the cash flow statement is a descriptive report. Everything you write in there describes the nature of the cash flow rather than the name of the ledger. So the best way to do it is you always, in the cash flow statement, want to pretend someone pointed at the item and said, what's that for? And you write, that's receipts from debtors. You don't write debtors control. Then you want to, if someone points at it and says, what's that for? You say, that's the GST received or the GST paid. You don't write GST clearing. You say payments to creditors. You don't say creditors control. You write cash purchases of stock. You don't write stock control. You write purchase or sale of vehicle. You don't write vehicle, and so on. So make sure with the cash flow statement, it's a descriptive report and it's not a balance sheet. It doesn't just list the names of ledgers.